Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. I've already made several videos where I debunk anti-communist Vladimir Brovkin's claim that the Mensheviks were extremely popular and the Bolsheviks extremely unpopular. I will link a playlist with all the other videos in the description. In this video I'm not going to be talking about popularity very much or the election results. I've done that exhaustively in a previous episode which you can check out. So instead, in this one, I'll be focusing on another one of Brovkin's main claims, which is that the Bolsheviks supposedly had to destroy the Soviets in order to maintain their own power. My main claim is that the Bolsheviks didn't destroy the Soviets, and although the Soviets changed from being continuous mass meetings into being state organs, and although they started to become more centralized, having a powerful executive committee, etc., all of that was actually taking place already before the October Revolution, when the Mensheviks and SRs still had a majority in the Soviets, and before the Bolsheviks gained the majority in the Soviets. And furthermore, the Soviets were initially, after the February Revolution, elected quite unfairly, where the soldiers had many more delegates than workers, despite being a smaller number of people than the workers. The election started to become increasingly more fair, and the number of workers in relation to soldiers started to increase over time, which benefited the Bolsheviks and helped them win power and carry out the October Revolution. And this brings into question even the initial popularity that the Mensheviks supposedly had. Because when the Mensheviks initially had electoral success immediately after the February Revolution, the elections were not really representative. It is also important to note that even though the number of workers increased and the number of soldiers diminished, that is not the only reason that the Bolsheviks gained the majority. It is also because the soldiers too went over to the side of the Bolsheviks and abandoned the Mensheviks. Alright, so now I've stated my claim, and now I will go on to prove it. One of the central claims of Brovkin is that Bolsheviks had to destroy the Soviets in order to maintain their own power. In reality, the Soviets continued to exist throughout the existence of the Socialist Soviet Union, and they served as the local executive and legislative organs of the state, and the Congress of Soviets in the Lenin era and the Supreme Soviet in the Stalin era were the highest government organs. In fact, the number of Soviets continued to increase under Bolshevik rule, doubling in the rural areas after 1918. E.H. Carr has written about the creation of Soviets even in the tribal communities in the 1920s. He says absolutely nothing about the supposed destruction of the Soviets, quite the contrary. Therefore, we must ask what Brovkin and his ilk mean by the supposed destruction of the Soviets by the Bolsheviks. There are a number of options, and in fact I think Brovkin believes a combination of all of these. Option 1. The anti-communist parties were eventually removed from the Soviets. For Brovkin and other anti-communists, this seems like horrible tyranny and an outright destruction of the Soviets, because they see the Soviets as nothing but municipal councils where different parties bicker. Option 2. They claim that the Soviets were practically destroyed because of temporary restrictions or other arrangements implemented during the Civil War. However, these arrangements were all only temporary, lasting at most 3 years. Therefore, they do not count as destroying the Soviets. And option 3, they claim that since certain changes took place in the structure and functions of the Soviets, it amounted to their destruction. This argument warrants a more thorough examination. When the Soviets were created after the February Revolution, they were more like permanent mass meetings than government organs. Their election procedures and function was extremely chaotic. Brovkin and other anti-communists claim that this was the only genuine Soviet movement. Brovkin claims that Bolsheviks ruined the Soviets by giving all the power to the Soviet executive committees and functionaries, but in reality, the Soviets could never have remained in the same form for all time. The early chaotic form couldn't achieve what the Soviets wished to do. The Soviets were far too large to get any effective work done, which was pointed out constantly by the Soviet delegates themselves. The Soviets of the early days were in constant or nearly daily meetings, but obviously, quote, the mass meeting character of the Soviets of the early days could not be permanently maintained, unquote, as bourgeois historian Chattopadhyay writes. Anti-communists claim that because of bureaucratic Bolshevik tyranny, the Soviets delegated power to the executive committees, held meetings more rarely than before, etc. But all these things actually happened already when the Mensheviks and SRs had the majority in the Soviets. The election practices in the early days were also not satisfactory, either from the point of view of fairness, practicality, or formal democracy. In some Soviets, delegates could be elected to represent 100 people, while in another Soviet they might represent 1,000 people. A workplace of 500 people might have as many delegates as a workplace of 1,000 workers. Workers were also seriously underrepresented in the early Soviets, while soldiers were hugely overrepresented. Obviously, there could be differences between different localities, but these kinds of differences shouldn't occur in the same location. Anweiler writes, quote, "In the early weeks of its existence, the Petrograd Soviet resembled a huge permanent assembly of workers and soldiers. The number of delegates grew from day to day. In the first week of March, it reached 1,200. By the second half of March, it rose to almost 3,000. Of this number, about 2,000 were soldiers and only 800 were workers, although at this time the total number of workers in Petrograd was 2 or 3 times that of soldiers stationed in the garrison. The reason for this disproportion was that each military unit, even the smallest company, sent its own delegate to the Soviet. There was as yet no rigorous check of delegates' credentials, so that a number of outsiders found their way to the Tauride Palace. Under such circumstances, even though all delegates were never present at any one time, the Soviet's plenary sessions were poorly organized. They resembled demonstrations and rallies more than they did a working parliamentary institution. Aside from the plenaries, the worker and soldier deputies conferred in separate sections on particular problems. But even these specialized bodies were still numerically too large to carry out regular work. On March 18th and 19th, therefore, both sections discussed various detailed proposals for a reorganization to reduce the number of deputies and increase efficiency. Several speakers pointed out that the Soviet composition was fortuitous, that is, somewhat accidental or random, and that new elections would have to be held to create a truly democratic basis." Unquote. However, Anweiler claims that the Executive Committee played a most important role since the very beginning, already when the Mensheviks and SRs held a majority. The important role of the Executive Committee was probably enhanced in those early days because the bloated Soviet session was ineffective. He writes, quote, "Most practical activity, however, remained in the hands of the Executive Committee, which maintained its preeminence dating from the first days of the revolution." Unquote. Quote, "A special bureau of the Executive Committee with 7 members was formed in mid-March to deal with current business. On April 12th, the bureau was authorized to take independent political decisions in emergencies, with only retroactive confirmation by the Executive Committee required. In the course of about 2 months, the Petrograd Soviet thus changed from a provisional revolutionary organ into a well-organized administrative machine. The execution of its business required several hundred employees. However, as the Soviet worked more efficiently, it lost proportionately its direct contact with the masses. The plenary sessions, almost daily during the early weeks, were less frequent and only sparsely attended by the deputies." Unquote. I think it is not correct to claim that the Soviet was losing contact with the masses simply because meetings were not held every single day, and simply because not everyone attended every meeting. These kinds of criticisms by anti-communists are totally unreasonable. A revolution is an extraordinary time. During a revolution, the masses might spend all day in mass meetings, but that cannot go on for very long. People have to go back to work, into production. It is not possible for the thousands of delegates to sit in permanent assembly all their lives. Ironically, if the delegates spent all their time in Soviet meetings and never went back to their regular jobs, that would actually mean that the Soviet would lose contact with the masses. In any case, the most important takeaway from this is that these phenomena were not caused by the Bolsheviks, but they already existed when the Mensheviks and right SRs controlled the Soviet. Feiges agrees with Anweiler that already under the Mensheviks and right SRs, Soviet meetings, quote, began to decline in frequency and attendance as the initiative switched to the executives and their quasi-governmental commissions, whose members were increasingly nominated by the party caucuses. From popular organs of direct self-rule, the Soviets were thus already beginning to be transformed into complex bureaucratic structures, although this process is more commonly associated with the period after 1917. At the time, it seemed a natural development." Unquote. Anweiler says, quote, Election procedures favored preponderance of soldiers in the United Soviets, that is, in Soviets, which combined delegates of workers and soldiers, in many places besides Petrograd. In Saratov, for example, 2 delegates were elected for each 350 workers, and also 2 soldiers for each company, 250 men. In Tula, 1 delegate for each 500 workers, and 1 for each company. In Ivanovo-Vozhnechensk, 1 delegate for each 500 to 1,000 workers, and 1 for each additional 1,000, but among the soldiers, again 1 delegate for each company, that is, for half or quarter the people. In elections of workers' delegates, small plants were usually favored over large ones, since even factories with few workers were eager to have a delegate in the Soviet. In Moscow, 1 deputy was elected for each 500 workers, but never more than 3 from a single factory. Thus, a plant with 1,500 workers sent 3 delegates to the Soviet, but so did one with 7,000 workers. In Samara, factories and workshops of 20 to 100 workers elected 1 deputy, those of 200 to 300 had 2, those of 300 to 1,000 3, and those of 1,000 to 2,000 5 deputies, unquote. After the February Revolution, quote, the official ratio of representation for the workers' section in the Soviet was 1 deputy for 1,000 workers. However, concerns employing fewer than 1,000 workers were also allowed to send 1 delegate. Thus, large plants with over 400 employees, accounting for 90% of all Petrograd workers, furnished 424 delegates, while concerns with fewer than 400 employees, accounting for 13% of all workers, had 422 delegates. One could not, therefore, speak of equal suffrage. This failing was occasionally discussed in the Soviet, unquote. Under the Mensheviks, the soldier deputies were overrepresented, and, quote, the soldiers' deputies included relatively numerous intellectuals, clerks, young ensigns with socialist or liberal leanings, medics and the like, the masses of politically inexperienced and still partially illiterate peasants in uniform voted for those who were most overtly revolutionary. In general, officers had the greatest influence in soldiers' councils, wherever these were independent and the working class weak, unquote. The Mensheviks sometimes claimed that they represented the workers, while the Bolsheviks supposedly received their support only from the peasant soldiers. In reality, as I will show later, the workers were the most firm support of the Bolsheviks. When soldiers were overrepresented, it benefited the Mensheviks. However, the soldiers also eventually went over to the Bolsheviks, long after the workers had already done so. Menshevik Sukhanov also admits that after the February Revolution, quote, the number of members of the Soviet had reached Homeric and absurd figures, unquote, and that there was need for centralization. Sukhanov even calls the Menshevik-SR Soviet illegitimate because it was elected in such improper ways, had such overrepresentation by soldiers, and didn't correspond to the true opinion of the masses. He mentions that the Mensheviks therefore tried to prevent re-elections in order to retain their undeserved position. Quote, there were 2 or 3 times as many workers as soldiers in Petersburg. The workers elected 1 deputy per 1,000, the soldiers 1 per company. That is, the soldiers had between 4 and 5 times greater representation. What about the crying disproportion in the representation of the workers and soldiers, with the Petersburg proletariat being completely swamped by the unstable peasant soldiers? This question too was not settled for many months, almost down to the October overturn itself. It was not in the interest of the new Soviet majority, which controlled Soviet and state policy and was completely reliant on this artificial, illegitimate peasant-soldier majority. In the last analysis, however, this ostrich-like policy did not help them, unquote. Right SR Eroshkin was complaining that even throughout 1918 there was too little centralization and, quote, each business Soviet was deciding things for itself without regard to or taking account of the general industrial condition of the country, unquote. Eroshkin, of course, was totally hostile both to workers' control and also to the Soviets themselves. According to a social democrat writer, quote, the revolution, therefore, brought the Soviets into life on an economic basis and for an economic purpose, and in their first inception they were anarchic and without any common plan of action. During the first few weeks of the Russian Revolution, one Soviet knew nothing of what the other was doing. Only after the first month was it possible to talk of an organization which was gradually uniting and coordinating the actions of all the Soviets scattered about the country. This coordination became most imperative for the safety of the revolution, because the forces of the old social order, which had been overthrown, soon began to gather strength again. One group of workmen often struggled with another group in the attempt to get a hold of the much-needed raw materials. Meanwhile, famine became worse and worse, and the workers' Soviets were in danger of turning into committees for grabbing whatever they could get for their own members. Then the Bolsheviks came along, and in October, when they came into power to control the Soviets, gave latter political as well as economic power as an organized proletarian mass." Unquote. Even the magazine of the anarcho-syndicalist IWW writes that the Soviets are not sufficient for the task of reorganization of the economy unless supplanted by a national trade union. The Bolshevik party or government did not seek to undermine the Soviets or centralize their functions. Instead, as Rabinovich writes, quote, "Changes in the Soviets' role and position appear to have been gradual, unplanned and unsystematic, with surprisingly little in the way of direction or attempts at control by higher governmental or party authorities. Indeed, the evidence shows that many of the new responsibilities that the District Soviet assumed during the first half of 1918 were undertaken on the Soviets' own initiative in response to this or that new problem or crisis." Unquote. Before winning over also the soldiers, the Bolsheviks gained the most popularity in the organs which were thoroughly proletarian. Anweiler writes, quote, "Factory committees became footholds for the Bolshevik party much sooner than did workers' and soldiers' councils. At the first municipal conference of Petrograd factory committees, May 30th to June 3rd, 1917, 499 delegates met. The Bolsheviks predominated in the Central Council elected by the conference. Bolshevik influence made itself felt much earlier in the country's industrial centers and in the principal cities, especially among factory workers. Thus, the Conference of Factory Committees in Petrograd at the end of May adopted a Bolshevik resolution by a large majority. Demonstrations in Petrograd in June 18 used almost exclusively Bolshevik slogans. By October, all trade unions in the large industrial cities supported Lenin's party, except for the important Railroad Workers Association, the Postal and Telegraphic Union and the printers." Unquote. I'll talk about this more later, but the highly paid printers supported Menshevism, the Postal and Telegraphic Union supported the SRs, while the Railway Union was more mixed, although Menshevik officials had temporary control of its leadership. Brovkin claims that the Bolsheviks wanted to make the Soviets be controlled by small, undemocratic executive committees, but the recognition that the huge size of the Soviets must be scaled down was reached by the Soviets themselves, long before the Bolsheviks gained a majority there. In Menshevik Sukhanov's opinion, even the executive committee was too large and required more centralization. He writes, quote, "Towards the middle of March 1917, the executive committee was already a corporation of about 40 men, if not more, and was rather cumbersome." Unquote. Brovkin claims that the Mensheviks and right SRs represented real democracy while the Bolsheviks wanted to destroy the Soviets. Of course, throughout the course of this series we've seen that the Mensheviks and right SRs everywhere themselves were destroying and stamping out the Soviets. But what was their actual ideological and theoretical position on the Soviets? The right SRs and Mensheviks often stated that the Soviets should be dissolved outright. The right SR Kerensky, quote, himself assured the British ambassador, Sir George Buchanan, as early as May that the Soviets will die a natural death. Unquote. Menshevik leader Tsereteli said, quote, "Whenever in any region democratic organizations, he means city dumas and zemstvos, replace the Soviets, the latter will voluntarily hand over their work. Soviets will exist only before the change. When democratic self-governing bodies are elected by universal suffrage, they will assume the functions of self-government previously exercised by the Soviets." Unquote. The Mensheviks always stressed universal suffrage, by which they meant that landlords, aristocrats, czarist officials and capitalists also should be able to vote and become candidates. Anweiler writes, quote, "Mensheviks and social revolutionaries wanted a gradual transfer of Soviet functions to the provisional government and later to the National Constituent Assembly, the democratic municipal dumas and the local zemstvos. During this transfer, the Soviets would become ineffective or disappear altogether." Unquote. And according to another right SR writer, quote, "When the revolutionary storm had subsided, and when, with the aid of the Soviets and the political parties, the necessity of the retention of the acquired liberties had penetrated deeply into the consciousness of the people, when laws fixing definitely the rule of the people locally, township, village and the government zemstvo, and centrally for all Russia, the Constituent Assembly, based on the fundamental practices of universal democracy and the Socialist International, universal direct, equal and secret suffrage, were drawn up and adopted, the Soviets should have retired in favor of the new governmental democratic institutions," unquote. In other words, they should be dissolved and replaced by an ordinary capitalist parliament and ordinary capitalist municipal organs. He further writes, quote, "The Soviets are not a democratic institution. They do not represent the people, and they cannot, in fact, owing to their very form, represent it. We, Russian Democrats and Socialists, are opposed to the Soviets and stand for a constitutional assembly and for all those who support it," unquote. Voljubev, in a book edited by Brovkin, writes that, quote, "The Menshevik leaders feared the convocation of the Congress of Soviets and tried to delay it, and that is because they knew that the Bolsheviks had gained majority." He continues, in an Izvestia editorial by the Mensheviks, called The Crisis of Soviets, on October 13th, so right before the October Revolution, the Mensheviks argued that the Soviets were losing their democratic potential. By their very composition, they represented only the workers, soldiers and peasants. They began to act as centers of political authority and were divisive and counterproductive. The Mensheviks preferred to support institutions of local self-government, dumas and zemstvos, which were elected on the basis of universal franchise and represented the entire society. It is difficult to reproach the Mensheviks for this reasoning, for their goal was establishing a parliamentary republic," unquote. So, as you can see, the Mensheviks' whole thing is that they're upset that the capitalists are not included. They constantly say there has to be universal franchise, we have to let the capitalists and the landlords also in. And Voljubev quite correctly states that, well, of course, the goal of the Mensheviks was establishing a parliamentary republic. That's why this whole thing is kind of so ridiculous, because how can you claim to support Soviet power if you oppose a Soviet republic? And you want a parliamentary republic. The Menshevik Central Committee stated in its declaration of December 2nd, 1919, that, quote, "All power to the Soviets, in its original sense, as it was understood by the masses that made the October Revolution, means anarcho-federalist chaos," unquote. So the Mensheviks clearly did not have a very high opinion of Soviet power, and far from thinking that it means some kind of bureaucratic tyranny, they actually thought that it meant anarchistic chaos, where everybody does whatever they want. The leader of the left Menshevik faction, Martov, said that the form of Soviet organizations was in all respects inferior to democracy. He defined the Soviets as being nothing more than one form of militant organization of the working class arising in time of revolution, which should be judged according to their capacity to realize the political and other tasks of the proletariat, unquote. So he says that the Soviets are inferior to bourgeois democracy and that they are only one form of struggle organs, but that they should only be temporarily used, and that the workers certainly should not take all power into the hands of the Soviets and turn them into a Soviet state. This is also what Kautsky says. Lenin, in his classic work, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, writes, quote, "Kautsky has to admit that the Soviet form of organization is of worldwide and not only of Russian significance, that it is one of the most important phenomena of our times, and that it promises to acquire decisive significance in the future great battles between capital and labor. But imitating the wisdom of the Mensheviks, who have happily sided with the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, Kautsky deduces that the Soviets are all right as so-called battle organizations, but not as so-called state organizations. Marvelous! Form up in Soviets, you proletarians and poor peasants. But for God's sake, don't you dare win. Don't even think of winning. The moment you win and vanquish the bourgeoisie, that will be the end of you, for you must not be so-called state organizations in a proletarian state. In fact, as soon as you have won, you must break up," unquote. And that's absolutely true. That is exactly what the Mensheviks and SRs wanted. The Mensheviks and SRs often demanded that the Soviets be dissolved completely, and that is also what they tried to implement in actuality everywhere they could. However, some of them dishonestly paid some lip service to the Soviets, saying that the Soviets should exist temporarily, or that they were only struggle organs but not state organs, or that they were organs of municipal self-government. This was the Menshevik position since 1905, meaning that they should become the same as municipal dumas and also include capitalists in their ranks. Some Mensheviks stated that such capitalist Soviets, which were in fact just municipal dumas, should exist under the power of the bourgeois parliament. But in reality, the Soviets existed originally as dual power. They controlled nearly all the power in the locality and competed with the power of the capitalist state. They even gave orders to the army. No capitalist government could ever tolerate dual power for long. It was impossible for the Soviets to remain in existence if power was given to the capitalist parliament. Soviet power could only exist if Soviets took all the power to themselves and overthrew the capitalists, which the Mensheviks and SRs firmly opposed. Brovkin tries his best to support the Mensheviks, but the truth comes out. He writes that the Mensheviks, quote, as Democrats believed in universal suffrage, hence if they, or they together with the SRs, won a majority in a Soviet, their duty was to vote to pass power to the City Duma, since that body was elected by universal suffrage. Yet as socialists they were bound by the wishes of their worker constituents, among whom the idea that power should belong to the Soviets was still quite popular. The workers did not necessarily want to see power transferred to the Dumas. The Mensheviks in the Soviets increasingly emphasized their role of protecting the Soviets, unquote. So even though he tries to make all kinds of mental gymnastics, what he is saying in actuality is that the Mensheviks wanted to dissolve the Soviets or give all the power of the Soviets to the City Dumas, but the workers didn't approve of that.